Here's what's actually happening in California right now. The state auditor just released a report that's causing significant concern in Sacramento, and it centers on something most people assumed was already being tracked closely, where billions of dollars in homelessness spending have actually gone, and whether that spending is making any measurable difference. The findings suggest something more troubling than simple mismanagement. They point to a fundamental breakdown in how California approaches one of its most visible and challenging problems. Before we dive into what the audit found, I want to frame why this matters beyond the obvious human cost. California has been spending unprecedented amounts of money on homelessness over the past several years. We're talking about roughly $24 billion since 2019, which works out to more than the entire annual budget of many states. Despite this massive investment, visible homelessness has increased in most major California cities during this same period. That disconnect between spending and outcomes is what makes this audit particularly significant. The state auditor's report, released in early 2024, examined 5 major California cities and how they've been tracking homelessness spending and outcomes. The cities included San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Jose, and Sacramento. What the auditors discovered wasn't exactly fraud or corruption in the traditional sense. Instead, they found something arguably more concerning: a complete absence of the basic systems you'd expect for tracking whether $24 billion is accomplishing anything at all. Let me break down the specific findings because the details matter here. The audit found that California's Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is supposed to coordinate statewide efforts, has not established even basic outcome measures for tracking whether homelessness programs are working. The state created this council specifically to bring coherence to homelessness policy, but it hasn't defined what success looks like or how to measure it. That's not a technical oversight. That's a foundational failure of governance. At the local level, the audit found that 4 of the 5 cities examined couldn't demonstrate whether their homelessness programs were cost-effective or even achieving their stated goals. San Francisco, for instance, has been spending over $1.1 billion annually on homelessness services. Yet the city couldn't provide the auditors with reliable data showing how many people successfully transitioned from homelessness to stable housing, how long they stayed housed, or what it actually cost per person to achieve that outcome. What's interesting is that this isn't because the data doesn't exist. Many individual programs and nonprofits do track outcomes for their specific services. The problem is systemic fragmentation. The state and cities have created a patchwork of hundreds of different programs, each with different funding streams, different reporting requirements, and different definitions of success. Nobody is synthesizing this information into a coherent picture of what's working and what isn't. The audit also found that the state hasn't been regularly collecting data from local governments about homelessness spending, which means Sacramento genuinely doesn't know how much money cities are receiving from various state sources or how they're using it. This isn't speculation. The auditor explicitly stated that the lack of outcome data makes it impossible to determine whether California's substantial investments are having any meaningful impact on reducing homelessness. To understand how California ended up in this situation, you need to understand the state's broader fiscal structure, which I think most coverage of this story has missed. California's budget operates on what Governor Newsom himself once described as an electrocardiogram pattern. The state's revenues swing dramatically from massive surplus to deep deficit because of how the tax system is structured. Here's the critical detail. California gets more than 60% of its general fund revenue from personal income taxes, and within that, the top 5% of earners pay roughly 70% of all income tax collected. These high earners derive a significant portion of their income from capital gains, which means their taxable income rises and falls with the stock market. When tech stocks surge, California's coffers overflow. When markets correct, the state faces billion-dollar deficits. This created the perfect storm for homelessness funding. In 2021 and 2022, California experienced a historic budget surplus of nearly $100 billion, driven largely by pandemic-era tech company valuations and stock market gains. The state suddenly had more money than it knew what to do with, and homelessness was perhaps the most visible policy failure in major cities. So Sacramento massively ramped up spending. But here's what happened. That money got distributed rapidly through existing bureaucratic channels without first establishing the infrastructure to track outcomes. The state created new programs, expanded funding for existing ones, and pushed billions to local governments. The urgency to spend the money while it was available overtook the more difficult work of building accountability systems first. Then, predictably, the surplus vanished. By 2023 and 2024, California was facing projected deficits of $56 billion over 2 years as tech stocks cooled and capital gains income dropped. The Legislative Analyst's Office projects these deficits could reach $35 billion annually by 2028 if nothing changes. Suddenly, the state is in budget crisis mode, cutting programs and dipping into reserves. But it can't even clearly explain what the previous spending accomplished. The part most people miss is how this audit finding intersects with California's broader housing crisis. The state doesn't just have a homelessness problem, it has a severe housing shortage that drives up costs for everyone, which in turn makes it easier for people to fall into homelessness and harder to exit it. California needs to build roughly 180,000 new housing units annually just to keep pace with demand, but it's been averaging closer to 80,000 units per year for decades. This shortfall has pushed median home prices above $800,000 statewide and rents to levels where a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco averages around $3,000 monthly. In this environment, even people with jobs can become homeless following a medical emergency, job loss, or family crisis. What the audit reveals is that California has been treating homelessness primarily as a services problem rather than a housing supply problem. The $24 billion has largely gone toward shelters, outreach programs, mental health services, and substance abuse treatment. These services are genuinely necessary, and many do help people. But if you don't increase the supply of affordable housing at the same time, you're essentially trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. People exit homelessness through your programs, but others immediately fall into it because rents keep rising. Here's a specific example of how this plays out. Los Angeles has been spending over $1 billion annually on homelessness. Some of that money goes toward programs that successfully get people into temporary housing. But many of those people cycle back onto the streets within months because there's no affordable permanent housing available. The city's vacancy rate for apartments is around 3%, which economists consider effectively zero. In a healthy housing market, you'd see vacancy rates around 5 to 7%. Without that buffer, people experiencing any income disruption have nowhere to go. The audit's finding that the state can't track outcomes means California can't even identify which approaches are most effective at keeping people stably housed. Is it more cost-effective to invest in permanent supportive housing with wraparound services? Or should the state prioritize rapid rehousing that gets people into apartments quickly with time-limited rental assistance? Or should California focus on building more affordable housing units, even if that means less money for services? Without data, these become ideological debates rather than empirical questions. In my view, the most likely outcome is that this audit forces some improvements in data collection and reporting, but doesn't fundamentally change California's approach to homelessness. Here's why. Fixing the accountability problem is politically easier than addressing the underlying housing shortage that drives homelessness in the first place. Sacramento will probably create new reporting requirements and outcome measures. The Interagency Council will likely develop metrics for success and start collecting better data from local governments. These are necessary steps, but they're also the low-hanging fruit. They let officials say they're responding to the audit without confronting the harder structural issues. The harder structural issue is that California's housing shortage stems from local zoning laws and permitting processes that make it extremely difficult and expensive to build new housing. Single-family zoning covers roughly 75% of residential land in most California cities, which legally prevents construction of apartments and other multi-family housing in vast areas. Environmental review requirements under the California Environmental Quality Act can delay housing projects by years and add millions in costs. And neighborhood opposition to new development remains intense in many communities. Reforming these systems requires overriding local control, which creates fierce political resistance. It means telling wealthy homeowners in places like Palo Alto or West Los Angeles that yes, larger apartment buildings are going to be built in their neighborhoods. The state has actually made some progress on this front with recent legislation that limits single-family zoning and streamlines approval for certain housing projects, but implementation has been slow, and construction timelines mean we won't see significant supply increases for years, even if policies change today. Unless something changes, California is likely heading toward a scenario where homelessness remains persistently high, even with continued high spending. The state will have better data about which programs move people into housing. But without enough housing supply, success for one person often just means someone else becomes homeless instead. It's a zero-sum game when the total number of affordable units is fixed. The pressure point here is what happens during the next recession. California's budget will almost certainly face another severe crunch when the economy eventually slows and capital gains income drops again. At that point, the state will need to make very difficult choices about maintaining homelessness funding levels. If spending gets cut significantly before the housing supply problem is solved, visible homelessness could increase dramatically. That could create a political crisis that finally forces more fundamental reforms. I think what state officials are underestimating is how this audit erodes public trust in California governance more broadly. When voters hear that $24 billion was spent on homelessness, but the state can't demonstrate outcomes and homelessness increased anyway, it doesn't just affect attitudes about homelessness policy. It raises questions about competence across the board. California already has a complex relationship with taxation and spending. The state has some of the highest income taxes in the nation, with top earners paying over 13% to the state alone. Sales taxes in some cities exceed 10%. Property taxes are somewhat lower due to Proposition 13. But that creates its own problems by making the state budget heavily dependent on volatile income tax revenue from high earners. Most Californians accept high taxes because they expect high-quality public services in return. The implicit bargain is, we'll pay more, but we expect better schools, maintained infrastructure, and solutions to visible problems like homelessness. When that bargain appears broken, support for taxation can erode quickly. We're already seeing evidence of this in migration patterns. California experienced net domestic outmigration of roughly 500,000 people between 2020 and 2023. Most people leaving are middle-income earners heading to states like Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, where housing costs are lower and taxes are reduced. The very wealthy tend to stay because they benefit from California's unique economic opportunities. The very poor often can't afford to leave, but the middle is hollowing out. This migration pattern has fiscal implications beyond the obvious population loss. Middle-income earners pay substantial taxes but consume relatively modest public services per capita. When they leave, California becomes even more dependent on income from the wealthy, which makes the budget more volatile, since wealthy income is tied to capital gains. This creates a vicious cycle, where budget volatility leads to poor policy outcomes, which drives out middle-income residents, which increases budget volatility further. What seems broken to me is the absence of a forcing mechanism that makes California prioritize housing supply over other considerations. Environmental concerns are legitimate, neighborhood character matters, and local control has value. But California has effectively given each local community veto power over housing construction, which means housing doesn't get built anywhere because no neighborhood wants it nearby. The state needs a clearer hierarchy that says housing supply is a necessity that sometimes overrides local preferences. There's something deeper here that I think is worth considering. California's homelessness crisis and the state's inability to track whether spending is helping reflects a broader challenge about how we approach complex social problems. Homelessness isn't one problem. It's dozens of different problems affecting different populations for different reasons. Some people experiencing homelessness have severe mental illness and need intensive psychiatric care. Others have substance abuse issues requiring treatment. Some are families who lost housing due to economic circumstances and mainly need rental assistance. Others are chronically homeless individuals who've been on the streets for years and need permanent supportive housing with wraparound services. Each of these populations needs different interventions, and what works for one group may be ineffective for another. But California's fragmented approach means different programs serving different populations all compete for the same funding, often without clear evidence about comparative effectiveness. A family that just needs a few months of rental assistance to get back on their feet costs far less to serve than providing permanent supportive housing for someone with serious mental illness. But if the state doesn't track outcomes well, it can't make informed decisions about how to allocate limited resources. What's interesting is that some cities outside California have demonstrated measurable success in reducing homelessness. Houston, for example, has cut its homeless population by roughly 60% since 2011 using a coordinated, data-driven approach focused on rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. The key difference is that Houston created a centralized system where all service providers use the same assessment tools, share data, and coordinate placements. Outcomes get tracked consistently, and funding flows toward programs that demonstrate results. California could implement similar systems, but it would require giving up some of local control and program autonomy that different cities and nonprofits currently enjoy. That's politically difficult because many organizations have built their identities and funding around specific approaches to serving homeless populations. Consolidating into a more coordinated system means some organizations would lose autonomy or potentially lose funding entirely if their approaches prove less effective than alternatives. The audit of California's homelessness spending reveals something important about governance in America's most populous state. It's not primarily a story about corruption or missing money in the criminal sense. The money was spent, and much of it probably helped individual people. The problem is that California spent $24 billion without building the basic infrastructure to know whether that spending was accomplishing the broader goal of reducing homelessness. This happened because the state's volatile budget creates periods of sudden abundance that encourage rapid spending without adequate planning. It happened because California's fragmented governance structure splits responsibility across dozens of agencies and hundreds of local governments without clear coordination. And it happened because addressing homelessness requires solving the underlying housing shortage, which is politically harder than funding services. The path forward probably involves better data collection and outcome measurement, which is good but insufficient. The more fundamental fix requires California to dramatically increase housing supply by reforming zoning laws and streamlining construction approval. That's difficult because it requires overriding local opposition and accepting that neighborhoods will change. But without more housing, California can spend another $24 billion on homelessness with similar results. What this audit should prompt is a broader conversation about how California makes policy decisions and allocates resources. The state has enormous wealth, ambitious goals, and genuine commitment to addressing social problems. But good intentions and substantial funding aren't enough without the unglamorous work of building systems that track whether policies actually work. That's the lesson here. And it applies far beyond homelessness to how California approaches education, infrastructure, environmental policy, and nearly everything else the state tries to accomplish. The question facing California now is whether this audit becomes a turning point that forces more rigorous accountability, or whether it becomes just another report that generates headlines briefly before the cycle continues. My sense is that genuine change will require more than administrative reforms. It will require California's political leaders to make harder choices about overriding local control to increase housing supply, and to accept that solving homelessness means sometimes disappointing powerful constituencies who benefit from the current system. Until that happens, we're likely to see more audits revealing similar problems, more budget crises forcing difficult cuts, and more people living on California's streets despite enormous public spending meant to help them. Thank you for sticking around until the end of this video. If you enjoyed the analysis, drop a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you would like to see more of the videos. Have a nice day.